Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into a really core concept in evolution. How the world around a species, its ecology, and how it develops don't just fine-tune it, but can actually lead to the origin of totally new species.
Yeah, we're looking at how things like, you know, competition for food, avoiding predators, that sort of intense pressure, really forces life to adapt, sometimes super fast. And the big idea we're chasing is how this ability to adapt right now can actually kickstart the process of population splitting off.
Exactly. It's about that connection, that synthesis between adapting to survive day to day and the long-term outcome of becoming reproductively isolated.
Oh.
So to unpack this, we'll look at three main things. First, this idea of coevolution driving change, leading to phenotypic plasticity. Then we'll explore what that plasticity actually looks like, how organisms can change their physical form based on the environment. And finally, we'll connect that to the two major ways new species form, allopatric and sympatric speciation. Okay, let's dive in with that first idea. Phenotypic plasticity. We often start thinking about coevolution, right? Like a predator gets better at hunting, so the prey has to get better at escaping, and that pushes evolution along.
Precisely. And that intense ecological push often triggers what we call phenotypic plasticity. It's this amazing property where a single genetic blueprint, a single genotype, can actually produce different physical outcomes, different phenotypes or morphs, depending on signals from the outside world.
So it's not a change in the genes themselves, but in how those genes are expressed based on, say, a predator being nearby or the temperature changing.
Exactly. The genes hold the potential for change, but the environment pulls the trigger. It's a way for organisms to be flexible, especially if their world changes quickly or is unpredictable. We can even measure this using something called a reaction norm. It basically plots how a particular trait changes across a range of environmental conditions, shows you how sensitive that organism's development is to its surroundings.
Right, and it's important to distinguish this from, say, a caterpillar always turning into a butterfly, right? This programmed is constitutive. The kind of plasticity we're focusing on is facultative. It might not show up at all unless that specific environmental cue is present.
That's the key distinction. The ability is inherited, but the expression is conditional. And just briefly, this idea of adaptation driving divergence isn't limited to sexual species. Even organisms that reproduce asexually, like some rotifers that have survived for millions of years without sex, speciate. For them, it's more about selection favoring different gene functions over time, maybe picking up genes from other organisms. But the principle holds. Adaptation under pressure can lead to divergence.
Okay, let's get into some concrete examples of this facultative plasticity. The aquatic world seems full of them, often involving chemical signals.
Oh, definitely. Take rotifers, tiny aquatic animals, genus Brachionis. When a certain predator is around, it releases a chemical into the water. Now here's the cool part. Only some of the prey rotifers that hatch will develop these extra long spines.
Extra spines for defense makes sense. But why only some?
Well, think about the costs. Growing spines takes energy, might slow down reproduction. If all the prey became super defended, the predator might starve, which could collapse the whole system. This partial response, this plasticity, it sort of maintains a balance, albeit a costly one for the individuals involved.
Fascinating. It stabilizes the whole interaction. And we see something similar in water fleas, Daphnia, right? With the phantom midge predator.
Yes, Daphnia pulex. When they detect a chemical signal, a chiromone from the midge larva, they develop these quite dramatic changes. Enlarged heads, big pointy helmets, basically turns them into a much harder to eat mouthful.
But you mentioned Daphnia is interesting because this isn't just about predators.
Right. You can see similar helmet growth happening seasonally, apparently triggered by changes in water temperature or turbulence. It's a phenomenon called cyclomorphosis. It suggests the developmental pathway for the helmet is sensitive to various environmental stresses, not just the predator cue. And there are other examples too. Tadpoles getting chunkier tails to escape dragonfly larvae, or spadefoot toad tadpoles in crowded ponds, sometimes developing huge jaws and becoming cannibals. Extreme plasticity driven by resource competition.
Wow. Okay, shifting ashore onto land. There's a really striking example with a moth, isn't there? The North American emerald moth.
Nemoria arizonaria. Yeah, this one's a classic. It shows seasonal polymorphism, two different forms in one species, depending on the time of year, but it's all down to diet.
Diet? How does that work?
It's about tannins, those compounds in plants. In spring, the caterpillars hatch and feed on oak catkins, which are low in tannins. And guess what? They develop to look almost exactly like oak catkins. Camouflage. But caterpillars hatching in the summer feed on mature oak leaves. These are high in tannins. And these caterpillars develop to look just like oak twigs. Completely different appearance.
And the tannin level itself is the environmental cue triggering which path they go down.
Precisely. The tannin concentration flicks the developmental switch. And it matters hugely for survival. Studies show the cat can mimic morphs have much higher survival rates and produce more offspring, like 130 eggs versus maybe 80 for the twig morphs. Huge selective advantage.
That's incredible. So the environment directly shapes the body. We also see plasticity in behavior too, right? Like birds adapting.
Absolutely. There was a long 30-year study on European blue tits, Cyanistes caeruleus. It showed plasticity helped them cope with living in patchy forests, some areas deciduous, some evergreen. Birds that disperse longer distances tended to maintain plasticity, being generalists, whereas birds that stayed put, shorter dispersal, tended to become more locally specialized. And think about migrating birds adjusting to climate change. We see European migrants arriving earlier in spring now, significantly earlier, about 0.37 days earlier per year on average for the first arrivals. That's behavioral plasticity in action.
Okay, so we've established that environments can cause pretty radical changes in form, function, behavior. Plasticity is powerful. But you said earlier, adaptation alone isn't enough to make a new species. What's the missing ingredient?
Reproductive isolation, that's the crucial step. For speciation to occur, at least according to the widely used biological species concept, populations that used to interbreed need to stop exchanging genes. They need to become reproductively cut off from each other.
So things that keep populations mixing, like high gene flow, tend to keep them as one species. But anything that slows or stops that mixing allows them to drift apart genetically.
Exactly. Mechanisms that reduce gene flow are key. This can lead to differentiation, sometimes even creating what we call sibling species, species that look almost identical but don't interbreed, maybe because of behavioral differences. Think of Drosophila melanogaster and its sibling Drosophila simulans.
Right. So this leads us to the main ways speciation happens geographically: allopatric and sympatric.
That's right. Think of it like this. Imagine a single population spread out. Allopatric speciation is what happens when a barrier pops up a mountain range, a river changing course, a glacier advancing. It physically splits the population. The isolated groups then evolve independently, accumulating differences until, even if the barrier disappears, they can no longer interbreed.
That seems like the most straightforward way, geographically separated.
It's certainly easier to document. Sympatric speciation is, let's say, trickier. This is speciation happening without any physical barrier within the same geographic area. The populations diverge while living side by side.
How can that even happen if they're technically able to meet and mate?
It usually requires strong disruptive selection. Maybe selection favors individuals who specialize on different resources within that shared habitat, or mate at different times, or prefer different microhabitats. The individuals with intermediate traits get selected against.
And proving it happens sympatrically is tough, right? You have to be sure they weren't separated in the past.
Exactly. There are strict criteria laid out by Coyne and Orr for confirming sympatric speciation. Basically, you need to show the species are distinct, they're each other's closest relatives, sister species, their current ranges overlap significantly, and you can convincingly rule out any past period of geographic isolation.
Okay, so where does our friend phenotypic plasticity fit back into this sympatric puzzle?
Well, plasticity can provide the raw material, the variation, for that disruptive selection to act upon. If an environmental cue causes some individuals to develop a different morphology, and maybe that change also influences their mate choice or where they feed or when they're active, you suddenly have a mechanism for splitting the population from within.
Ah, so the plastic response itself helps create the reproductive barrier.
It can, yeah, especially if it involves behavior. Which brings us to a really famous example, maybe the poster child for sympatric speciation in progress, the apple maggot fly, Rhagoletis pomonella.
Right. Tell us about that one. They originally lived on a native fruit.
Hawthorn. Their native host plant is the hawthorn tree. But then, around the 1800s, humans introduced cultivated apples into the range in North America. Apples are related to hawthorns, but crucially, they fruit at a slightly different time.
Okay, so what happened?
A subset of the fly population started using these new apple trees as hosts. Because apples ripen earlier than hawthorns, these apple race flies evolved to emerge earlier in the season to match the fruit availability.
And the original hawthorn race flies stuck to their later schedule.
Yep. So now you have two groups of flies living in the same orchards, but they tend to mate with flies emerging at the same time, usually on their preferred fruit type. This difference in timing and host preference acts as a major barrier to gene flow between them.
So they're diverging genetically, right there in the same location, driven by the switch to a new host.
Exactly. We call it speciation in progress because the reproductive isolation isn't 100% complete, yet there's still a tiny bit of gene flow. But the genetic differences between the apple race and hawthorn race are clear, measurable, and linked directly to which host plant they specialize on. It's a fantastic real-time example.
Wow, okay, so that's an insect example in progress. What about vertebrates? Is sympatric speciation well documented there?
It's considered rarer, or at least harder to definitively prove in vertebrates, but the standout example is the cichlid fishes in Africa's Great Rift Valley lakes, particularly Lake Victoria.
Ah, yes, the cichlids, known for their incredible diversity.
Incredible is an understatement. It's an explosive, adaptive radiation. Lake Victoria, for instance, is relatively young. Geologically, it may have dried out completely around 12,500 to 14,000 years ago. Yet, since it refilled, something like 300 new species of cichlids evolved within that single lake.
300 species in less than 15,000 years. How is that even possible in one body of water? What's their trick?
Their trick, their key evolutionary innovation, appears to be their pharyngeal jaws. They have a second set of jaws located back in their throat, derived from gill arches.
A second set of jaws.
Yeah, and these pharyngeal jaws are highly adaptable, highly plastic in an evolutionary sense. They became specialized for processing food, crushing shells, grinding algae, slicing smaller fish. This freed up their main oral jaws to specialize purely on capturing different kinds of prey.
So one set for catching, one set for eating. That sounds efficient.
Supremely efficient. It allowed different lineages to rapidly specialize on very specific food sources and microhabitats within the lake, eating insects off rocks, scraping algae, eating scales off other fish, crushing snails, you name it. This ecological specialization, combined with strong mate choice, often based on color patterns, drove rapid reproductive isolation between groups, all within the same lake.
And this meets those strict criteria for sympatric speciation.
Largely, yes. The evidence points strongly towards sympatric divergence driven by ecological specialization and sexual selection, fulfilling the coin and ore requirements in many cases. It's probably the best vertebrate example we have.
Amazing. So plasticity in feeding apparatus opened the door for massive, rapid speciation.
Yeah.
Is there anything that kind of visually demonstrates this continuum from variation within a species to full speciation?
There is, actually. Ring species are perhaps the best illustration. The classic example is the Encetina eschscholtzi salamander complex in California.
How does that work? What's the ring?
These salamanders live in the mountains surrounding California's Central Valley. Think of the valley as a barrier they can't easily cross. So the original population likely lived up north, and then populations expanded southward down both the Sierra Nevada mountain range on the east side and the coast ranges on the west side.
Okay, so they're spreading south along two parallel paths.
Right. And as they spread south along each side, they adapted to local conditions, accumulating genetic differences. Where populations meet along the way, say halfway down the Sierra Nevada, adjacent subspecies can still interbreed. The gene flow connects them like links in a chain.
So far, so good. Still one species, just with local variations.
But here's the punchline. The ring closes in Southern California, where the two southward expansions finally meet again. By this point, the salamanders that came down the Sierra Nevada, E. cloudberry, and the ones that came down the coast ranges, E. schultzi, have diverged so much.
They don't interbreed anymore.
Exactly. They overlap geographically, they encounter each other, but they generally don't hybridize. They act as two distinct biological species where the ends of the ring meet. The Encetina ring beautifully shows you the whole process, from freely interbreeding populations in the north, through gradual divergence along the sides, to complete reproductive isolation at the southern closure. It's speciation caught in the act, laid out geographically.
That's a fantastic visual. It really drives home that speciation isn't always a sudden event, but can be a gradual process.
Absolutely. So wrapping up this deep dive, the big picture is really a synthesis. You have ecological pressures, competition, predation, resources driving the need for adaptation. Phenotypic plasticity provides a mechanism for rapid, flexible responses to that pressure. And then when that plastic response, whether it's a change in body shape or diet preference or timing of reproduction, becomes linked to reduced gene flow, often through strong selection, maybe disruptive or ecological selection, it provides the variation upon which reproductive isolation can be built. Adaptation fuels speciation.
It really highlights how interconnected development, ecology, and evolution are. The Encetina ring shows us the process laid out in space, And the apple magpie shows it happening through time right now. So here's something to ponder. Considering the apple magpie is diverging based mainly on timing and host choice, what do you think might be the next environmental pressure or behavioral shift needed to push that system over the edge into complete irreversible speciation? Something to think about until next time.